And now, without any further delay, let's begin today's event, the new TCPA Best Practices, Understanding the Impact of the July 10th FCC Rulings, sponsored by Neustar and hosted by Credit and Collections Risk. I'd like to introduce now your moderator for today's session, and that is Mike Sisk. Mike, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Phil, and I would like to welcome the audience once again. We are grateful that you've chosen to share some of your day with us. We know your time is valuable, and we'll honor that today with what I'm confident is going to be an engaging 60 minutes or so of discussion. Once again, our topic today is the new TCPA Best Practices, Understanding the Impact of the July 10th FCC Rulings. We have two excellent speakers with us today, and I would like to introduce them both to you now. Mitch Young is Neustar Senior Director, Risk and Identity, and Becky Burr, Chief Privacy Officer and Deputy General Counsel at Neustar. And I am Mike Sisk. I'll be your moderator today. I'm a contributing editor for American Banker, and I'm happy to be here. I'll be running some polls later on and the Q&A at the end. So, and yes, just a few housekeeping. We do have Q&A, as Phil mentioned. You do not have to wait until the end to put your questions in. Please, as they occur to you, as the Spirit moves you, put them in the queue, and we will make every effort to get to them in the time that we have. We usually have about 10 or 15 minutes. If for some reason we don't get to your question, we will follow up afterwards. So, fear not, your voice will be heard. Please ask anything you'd like. And we do have two polls today. We do share the results with the audience. It's real time. It's kind of interesting for everyone here to, I think, going to get a sense of where everyone else stands on the issue that we've come together to discuss today. So I always encourage 100% participation whenever possible because it does enrich the returns for all of us to see. So I think that's my little introductory spiel is finished up here. Let me turn things over to Mitch. Mitch, you've got the floor. Please take it away.
Great, thank you, and welcome everybody. I'm going to walk through an agenda in a moment so you can see what we're going to cover, and we're going to cover a pretty good bit of ground in terms of both background, legal interpretations, and some real-life applications of data available and what you can do. But before I do that, I wanted to start on this slide because this is the reason that everybody's here today. And what it is the number of lawsuits that have been initiated based on TCPA over the last several years. And our marketing team put this together. So what you'll see is a nice building and growing bar chart. So this looks like a very positive slide. I think they forgot the rain clouds and the storm. Because really this isn't a very positive slide. I think this is the reason that we have about 430 people registered for today's conference. And it's the fourth one we've done this month across many different industries. So I think today there are companies from the major financial institutions, agencies, first-party collections and third-party collections. There's lenders. Many of you are clients today, so we know this is a very serious and significant topic for everyone to tackle. I don't have the stats for 2015, and I hope you are all not dealing with too many TCPA lawsuits, but we know they're on the rise. So our agenda today is, first, we want to talk about a little bit around Neustar and what we do, because we do a lot, and we were mentioned in the recent FCC ruling, and I think it's important for people to understand what we actually do and why we did get mentioned. Then Becky's going to take a deep dive into the recent FCC ruling and legal interpretations. We'll then share a little, we did some industry research with collections and credit risk, and we'll share some highlights from that. It's interesting findings. And then we'll get into some TCPA compliance tips, both available data and how it can be used, and then an actual case study. And we'll show how, and this is a third-party collections use case, how that data is applied and some of the impact it can have both in dealing with TCPA risk mitigation and some of the operational impact it can have around right party contact rates. So there's a lot for us to cover, so we'll dig in. The first slide here is this is a little bit of background on Neustar, and I don't think there's many people that really know the full scope of what Neustar does and really why the FCC mentioned us. So Neustar was selected by the telcos as an identity partner. And I think I don't know many companies that sit in the position that we sit in to help manage identity in the telco industry. And I'll just cover a few of the things that we do. Probably the most important is we power about 70% of all the caller ID in the U.S. It's about 4 billion calls a day. Really, over 250 telcos have come to us and outsourced their caller ID. So they're giving us their subscriber data. We're managing that for them on a daily basis and then fulfilling caller ID for their client base. That's one of the things that we do within the caller ID world. We also secure data directly from the telcos. There's many carriers where you can access data directly. There's an SS7 network that we're linked into for both delivery and access to data. So it's a full scope of sources, but really we were selected by most of the telcos to deliver caller ID. And it's a huge piece of what Neustar does and the data that we have. We also deliver daily directory assistance in the U.S. So all of the many of the large cable operators have, who are our caller ID clients, have also asked us to be the authorized agent of their directory assistance to be delivered daily as phones are connected and disconnected. So we're probably the industry leader in providing daily connect and disconnect data for landlines as well as disconnect data for wireless phones out to the 411 publisher community and the large data companies that use this. We manage the daily port data as phones are ported from carrier to carrier. We provide market share analytics to the telcos so wireless carriers can figure out their market share as they figure out their marketing spend. So when you look at this, there is a really comprehensive set of services that the telcos have asked us to help them manage as it relates to their identity, their footprint, and their subscribers. We have the ability to use this repository for verification transactions, which we do across the financial community. If you're transacting over a credit card, one of the major credit card networks, we do verifications. In lots of e-commerce worlds, in lots of lending worlds, we use this data for verification. And, for years I've always said, for Neustar, phone is king. And there are lots of companies that deal with phone data. And it is really a lifeblood. Phones are a lifeblood to the collections marketplace. So we know, there are lots of skip tracers out there who have great phone data. I think for a long time they've been fueling the demand of the collections world, which has been a demand of quantity versus quality. While the data is good, the need to deliver quantity has been their biggest driver, and it's hard to shift. There are other companies that have pieces of what we do. Some have SS7 access, some have direct access to the telcos. And I think it's the comprehensive nature of what Neustar has that led to our mention rather than any kind of direct access or SS7 capabilities or whatnot. And it's really our partnership with the telcos that has put us in a unique position to provide data, the same data we've been providing out for years to help companies meet TCPA. And it's based on quality, accuracy, currency of the data. Within TCPA, there's a few key buckets of data that we've found to be most relevant. And it is really around phone ownership and reassignment. That is one of the key tenets of the TCPA rulings or TCPA guidelines, which is you need to make sure, whether you're manually dialing or really more auto-dialing, that ultimately you're reaching out to the intended recipient of a phone. And knowing phone ownership versus reassigned phone numbers is critical. Knowing phone type, whether or not a phone is landline or wireless with high confidence is critical. And what we found is knowing that a phone is active is an important component to not just meeting TCPA, but being very efficient in your operations. And ultimately, I think what TCPA is driven towards is very efficient, accurate, right-party contacts. And we found the combination of these three things, and I'll talk about these more after Becky talks about the legal insight, you'll find to be both compelling in its ability to help mitigate TCPA risk and more efficiently manage your contact to consumers. So before we dig into the legal review by Becky, I know we want to do a poll question.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Mitch. And as promised, we are. This is the first of the two for today. And what I'll do is I'll just read the question. I'll read the answers, and kind of while I'm doing that, if everyone would make their selection, and then by the end we should be able to share the results. So, what is the biggest challenge your company is facing regarding TCPA within your organization? We've got four different possibilities here. One, interpreting the law as it applies to your business and processes, or finding the best sources for phone data to mitigate TCPA risks, or determining if consumer consent to dial is still valid, that is, identifying that the phone has not been reassigned, or finally, determining what to auto-dial. So if everyone could weigh in on this initial question, that would be great. Give everyone just a couple more seconds to do that, and we'll share results with everyone, and we'll move along to Becky's portion of the program. All right, that's probably enough. Let me go ahead and show the results. So yes, so interpreting the law as it applies to your business and processes was definitely the biggest challenge, 53.6%, and then determining if consumer consent to dial is still valid, about 21%. So interesting results. Thank you all for participating in that. And let me go ahead now and share. No, I've already shared. I'm going to move things over to Becky. Becky, please take it away. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. And I think that poll was telling, the fact that more than half of you have difficulty figuring out what how the TCPA applies to your business leaves you in very good company. It is a confusing legislation. The regulation has added to the complexity, and the variety of lawsuits out there have not helped. I think it is for that reason that there were many petitions submitted to the FCC asking for clarification, which is the subject of that we're discussing today. But just a little bit of background on the TCPA first. Congress enacted the TCPA in 1991 to curb aggressive telemarketing practices. They were concerned at the emergence of the wireless age about shifting costs to wireless consumers. There were also privacy concerns about unsolicited calls to random or sequentially dialed numbers and the use of that kind of technology. And then public safety concerns related to dialing practices that could block a group of telephone numbers, for example, in a hospital. It's worth noting that TCPA was written in 1991, and it deals with 1991 technology, and part of our struggle is to apply it to the technology that we're actually living and working with on a day-to-day basis now. In 2013, the FCC issued some new regulations to bring the administration of the Telephone Consumer Protection Act more into line with the manner in which the Federal Trade Commission deploys the consent requirement in the do not list context. And they confirmed that in the telemarketing or teletexting context, the prior expressed consent requirement means that you must have written consent for marketing or calls or texts. And it also, the 2013 regulations also eliminated the existing business relationship exception. In the aftermath of the 2013 decision, and then the many lawsuits that we've seen where courts all over the country have come out in ways that are sometimes hard to reconcile. A number of parties issued requests for declaratory for clarification from the FCC, and finally, on July 10th, the declaratory order and ruling and order came out. It's ironic that many of the orders that, or many of the filings that they were responding to were requests for clarification, simplification, and some assistance in light of the fact that consumers are increasingly cutting the cord and moving into an all-wireless world where people with business relationships with consumers still need to have the ability to communicate with them. So the order provides responses to those variety of petitions. Today we're going to talk about what the FCC had to say about what an auto dialer is, how it's defined, who the called party is, and who you need consent from whom you need consent when you call. The FCC also had some things to say about the circumstances under which a consumer can revoke their prior express consent. They also talked about reassigned telephone numbers in the context of the called party, and then they provide some limited exemptions. So first, and perhaps this is one of the biggest outcomes, is a lot of people were asking for clarification on what an ATDS or auto dialer is in the context of changing technology. The FCC basically said, and I'm going to paraphrase, an auto dialer is something that can be used to dial a lot of numbers quickly without human intervention, and this isn't in their text exactly, and it's something that consumers are annoyed by. The obvious question is, what is human intervention? Is pressing a speed dial button human intervention? Is pressing a number that then dials something in a telephone system? Does that work? And unfortunately, the FCC reiterated that this standard had to be adapted on a case-by-case basis, that there was no bright line. They said on the sort of on the outer limits, something like a rotary dialer could conceivably be retrofitted or proactively fitted to be an auto dialer, but that's a very marginal and theoretical use. At the outer edge, another edge, the speed dial button on your smartphone might fit the bill, but that's not something that consumers are complaining about. So they're not. That is not a fall into the gambit of this ATDS definition. The other issue was the issue of the capacity to dial a lot of telephone numbers quickly without human intervention. The FCC, reiterated that this is not about present ability. It's not that the telephone equipment that you're using right then and there at the moment has the ability to act. It is being used as an auto dialer. Does the equipment have the capacity to store or produce and dial random or sequential numbers even if it's not being used for that. And even if you need additional software in certain cases, you still may have equipment that has the capacity to be an auto dialer. And as I said, this very much remains a case-by-case analysis, and therefore really doesn't provide a lot of clarity in avoiding litigation and dispute. The other thing that the FCC said that's new and important is that a called party must be permitted to revoke their consent at any time through any reasonable means. Now, the Commission didn't really give a lot of detail on any reasonable means, but at the least that means in places where you usually interact with your consumers on a telephone call, at your service centers, in retail locations, for example, where you transact billing with them. You need to be prepared to have consumers revoke their consent orally and have the ability to capture that consent and implement it so that you're not calling them. And bottom line is you can't place additional restrictions on revoking consent. Now, we don't know how far that goes. Is it permissible in your retail environment for somebody at the checkout counter to say, yes, of course you can revoke your consent, please go to the customer service desk, or does the customer, the teller at the checkout counter have to have the ability to process that? All that is somewhat up in the air. The other thing that the FCC clarified, and this has been the subject of litigation, is that it is not enough to get consent from a subscriber to a telephone service, telephone number, get consent from them, and then continue to dial that number even after the person from whom you get consent has turned in the telephone number and it's been reassigned. According to the FCC, the called party under the statute is the current subscriber of that number or a customary user, so another participant in a family plan, for example, is still is the customary user. And so the fact that you intended to call somebody who had given you consent earlier is irrelevant to the determination of who you called and who the called party is. Did I just skip one? No. A number of people said, it's pretty hard to learn about reassigned phone numbers. We have ways of knowing that a consumer has ported a telephone number from a wireless to a wireline number, but it's not all that easy to know when somebody has turned in the number. And by the way, the reassignment can happen very quickly. It must happen in 90 days, but it often happens far more quickly than that. The FCC pointed out that there are ways of learning about reassigned numbers, and some of the, obviously some of them make sense. There are databases that are not, we'll talk about those, that can help you identify when a number has been shifted. They pointed out you could have an interactive opt-out when you dial, look for triple tones that suggest disconnections. And one of their suggestions that is probably of no real help is that you could require consumers who give you their consent to tell you when they have transferred the telephone number. But good luck on that. and even if you do, that's not going to get you out of trouble for calling that number when it's been reassigned in case your customer forgets to tell you that they've turned in the telephone. The FCC did provide a sort of one free call or text exception to a reassigned number. So where a caller has a good faith belief that they have consent for to make an auto-dialed call to a wireless number, they have no actual or constructive knowledge that a number has been reassigned, then you are permitted to make one free call or text to that number. Here's the catch. If you don't talk to the person, if it goes into generic voicemail, if there's no answer, no matter what the outcome of the call is, once you've made a call to that number, you are deemed to have constructive knowledge of the reassignment. Now, obviously, this is not, nobody thinks that this is going to deliver real knowledge about a reassignment on any predictable or reliable basis. But what the FCC said was basically, we're just trying to strike an appropriate balance between feasibility of learning about calls, reassignments of telephone numbers, and consumer protection and the privacy and public safety issues that the TCPA is designed to reinforce. Then finally, they provided some limited exceptions in this context, limited exceptions for time-sensitive financial and healthcare calls and text made to consumers, text, for example, to let people know about data breaches. There also is an exception in the healthcare setting. In both cases, the text and telephone numbers that are subject to this exception must be free to consumer calls, or free to consumer calls or texts. There's some specific language that needs to be provided when you use those accepted texts or calls. There's a limit on how many of them you can send. And of course, you have to, you have to have gotten the telephone number from the consumer in the first place. So that's the background on the TCPA and on the recent FCC declaratory ruling and order. We're going to have time for Q&A afterwards, but I'm going to turn this back to Mitch in the meanwhile.
Well, thanks, Becky. We're very fortunate to have Becky as a Chief Privacy Officer here at Neustar to help us work through this stuff, and she's been wonderful in being available for various webinars and client meetings. So we'll talk a little bit now about some research that we did as we were beginning to work with companies in TCPA, and the one caveat is we did this research before the recent rulings. I think the results are still directionally correct and the same. I think what we've seen is an incredible both interest and demand and really need to tackle TCPA since those rulings. But we'll dig in. And the reason we initiated this research is what we saw was this tension between complying with TCPA and the operational demands it put on an organization, and how do you balance those two? If you're going to comply with TCPA, how do you deal with the operational impact it has, or where is the balance between those two so you're mitigating risk and also taking care of the organization's needs to be efficient? So we did a research study with collections and credit risk, and there were 211 respondents from the CCR subscriber base, and what we found were this segment of progressives. It was 32% of all the respondents that tended to be most of the companies that are attending today, those that have higher outbound call volumes, where outbound dialing is core to the business, and TCPA risk is a high priority. And really, that's why everybody's here today. And what we found is that was a core segment within those that responded. We were interested in the KPIs of what are these types of companies, what metrics are they using to manage and drive their business. And I don't think there's any ahas here. I think they're just what we expected, which is dollars collected per dial, right party contact rate, and cost per dial were the three biggest drivers, which really look at efficiency and revenue, right, which is not a surprise, but what we were looking to confirm. And right party contact is a key to collecting money was one anecdotal response that we got. And I think what we always have seen is, we've had the same data for, a couple decades. And within the collections environment, the auto dialer is so inexpensive that the cost to get accurate data always outweighed the cost of the auto dialer. It was just so inexpensive to auto dial that there could be higher tolerance for inaccurate data because the ROI was just made that okay. And I think now the frame of reference for investment is no longer looking at accurate data versus auto dial costs. It's now looking at accurate data versus lawsuits or lawsuit risk. And it's just shifted that ROI calculation significantly. We also looked at what are companies doing today to mitigate TCPA risk. And companies fell into three buckets. The dark blue at 50% is companies that have decided to exclusively manual dial mobile phones. They said, we don't want to auto dial a mobile phone at all. We're going to remove that risk and just manually dial. Those may be companies, we haven't broken this out by first party or third party, so this may tend to be more third party collectors who don't have consent, whereas 46% of companies are doing a mix of manual dialing mobile phones when they do have consent. So we believe that whether there's first party or third party, as long as there is consent at some point in the interaction, with good, accurate, verified data, there's no reason that some percentage of phones can't still be auto-dialed. So that's what we believe is an optimal mix. It does require, of course, consent and using the right technology. And then there's a very small percentage of companies that are exclusively auto-dialing mobile phones. And the last piece of research we'll share is, within companies, which department is currently, which of the following does your company or department currently use to scrub and prepare data to mitigate TCPA risk? And I think these are the things we expect to see, right? People are identifying phone types, 49%, and scrubbing so they can separate landlines from mobile phones. 38% are obtaining consent. 32% are doing actual phone verification to look for the potential of reassigned phone numbers, and then others are providing opt-outs. What we saw is there are a lot of companies that are yet to do this, and I think now we're seeing is everybody, the risk of not doing this and figuring out the proper sequence of both checks and an operational plan is critical for everybody. So before we shift next into some tips and available data and an actual case study of this data applied, we have one more poll question.
Great, thank you, Mitch. And yes, second of our two poll questions of the day, and kind of same drill as the first one. I'll read through the question and just read through the brief answers here, and that should give everyone enough time to weigh in. So let's I'll do that right now. Who is responsible for outbound dialing strategies and TCPA compliance within your organizations? Is it legal? Is it compliance? Call center operations? Or perhaps all of the above? So let me just, since I was able to read through that fairly quickly, let me just give you a few more seconds to make your selection here, and then we will rejoin Mitch and the final section of the program today. So, all right, I think that's probably enough time. Let me go ahead and share the results with everyone. And okay, so clearly all of the above is by far the greatest answer here for who is responsible for outbound dialing strategies. That would be legal, compliance, and call center operations. Call center operations, 20.6% was the second most selected answer there. So thank you so much for those answers, and I will now move things over to Mitch and invite Mitch to please continue on with your great talk.
Well, thanks. And I think those results are interesting. I was in a meeting yesterday at a financial institution, and I think there were representatives from every one of those categories there. And it was the first time I was in a meeting where there was actually someone whose title was Tcpa compliance officer. So for those of you dealing with it, it is something that requires a lot of effort now, and I think roles are getting created to make sure companies are complying as best they can. So we'll talk now about two things, some compliance tips and available data, and then an actual case study of this data applied. So in terms of compliance tips, and I don't think this is going to be tremendous news, but I think these are the core pieces of data that people need to consider. The first is, of course, proper consent, and we are not autodialer experts nor consent management experts at Neustar, so I'm going to leave that one aside and focus on really number 2 and 3 here, which is identifying phone type. It's critical to identify landline versus wireless phones accurately, and to be honest, that's actually not that hard. Also to incorporate porting data and as well from those that go from landline to wireless. And most good phone types should include that. We certainly include that in our solutions. I think the two other things to mention here are VoIP has come up as an issue, and there are different categories of VoIP. And OTT stands for over-the-top VoIP. And there are VoIP numbers through, let's say a Comcast, which is a pretty standard landline and a pretty standard plan that's not pay per minute by the subscriber. The ones that are potentially risky areas are the VoIP numbers that somebody's paying per minute for that VoIP access. And we are working to deliver a very granular VoIP carrier data to differentiate different types of over-the-top VoIP carriers versus more traditional VoIP carriers that are less risky. The last piece I'll mention is porting. It's important, but it's not the biggest risk. I've been in many meetings where people are I think using porting when they mean reassigned phone numbers, or thinking porting is a big issue. It is important. Phones that get ported from landline to wireless are important to differentiate. There are only 6 million of those phones ever that have gone through that porting. So it is really a very small piece of the challenge that you have. The much bigger area of risk is the ownership and reassignment. So for ownership, it's critical to verify that the phone number still belongs to the intended recipient. What we're seeing is reassignment of phones can occur in as little as 30 days. That means I disconnect my wireless phone today, and within 30 days that phone gets delivered out, reassigned to somebody else. So once it gets reassigned, there is risk if you continue to call autodial that phone number. There is, sometimes it takes 60 days or 90 days. We're seeing that between 90 and 120 days, a majority of phones that were disconnected get reassigned. So many companies are repeating verification every 30 days, especially for those that are dialing first-party debt. or have consent for third party and are auto dialing, it's those numbers that are getting auto dialed that require more frequency of verification to identify ownership versus reassignment. We know when phones get disconnected, there is that period between disconnect and reassignment that is this doldrum period, right? There's little risk because the phone's not reassigned to anybody yet, but it's in that process. And it's being able to identify movement of a phone number over that continuum of being assigned to the intended party, to disconnected, to reassigned, that's really important to be able to monitor so you can manage your operations. The one call exception, I think you need to use one call exception very carefully. In my opinion, the one call exception is a bit of an olive branch that's more of a rat trap because there's not much constructive knowledge you can glean from one phone call that no one picks up. So I think this is, a legacy of the industry feeding off quantity and wanting to dial phone numbers rather than focusing on quality. And I think if you, with the right steps in place, you can not even need to rely on the one call exception. And I think, anyway, that's my thoughts on it. And then I think what's critical is how do you use this information to auto dial and prioritize manual dials? And everybody is a bit different. Collection seems like a very similar effort for most organizations, and it's not as we see them. It's very different depending on the depth that you're calling, depending on your risk tolerance, and depending on your own operational thresholds. So I will talk about kind of one use case, and this is for a third-party collector. And what we saw as we ran data through our verification engine. And what we do is look at three things I mentioned in the beginning. We look at, can we verify phone ownership? Is the call, is it wireless or landline? And is that phone still an active phone number? And it's the combination of those three things that have brought pretty significant efficiencies. So what we were able to do was really show that 44% of phones, and the numbers is a little fluid between different portfolios, but in the third-party world, I think it's not uncommon to see a large percentage of phones within a portfolio that are bad. And we consider bad to be either reassigned or inactive. And for these, we could identify them and remove them for efficiencies. We can then look at 55% of the phone numbers that we can categorize as good phones. And in this analysis, this is a company that opted to manually dial all of their wireless phones, right? So instead of looking at which ones they could still auto-dial within first party where there's consent, this is really looking at, I've decided to manually dial to mitigate my risk. Now I have an operational burden. And what can I do to relieve some of that operational burden and focus on right party contact and dollars collected? And what we could identify is 55% of the good phones accounted for 92% of the revenue collected. So we could increase collection rates by 70 to 150%, increase right party contact rates by 60%. I'll walk through this in a little more detail. Essentially, 44% of bad phones that were being dialed, there's not much to gain here except CFPB oversight, potential of fines, or operational inefficiencies. And when it was an auto-dial world, it didn't really matter. Now that it's either a manual world or a very restricted auto-dial world, that accuracy does matter. So what we look at is, this is a bit of an eye chart, and really, I'll collapse this. The takeaway here is really, the color coding and some of the granularity. And what we do is we look at a pretty detailed analysis of whether or not we can verify that an individual goes with the phone. And if you look at the top, you'll see Neustar tiers, and in the columns, it's Tier A, Tier B, Tier C. Tier A are verified phones. Tier B are phones we can't conclusively verify or not verify, and Tier Cs are ones where we're saying, hey, these mismatch. This phone's been reassigned. And if you look down the left-hand side, you'll see we look at activity status of a phone. And we look at it pretty granularly to say, has this phone been consistently making phone calls for more than 12 months, which is at the top of that column? Or has this phone been inactive for over 12 months at the bottom? And what you can see in the top left-hand grid where it's dark green, those are right-party contact rates. So when phones are verified and very active, the right-party contact rates are much higher than average. And those at the bottom right, which are phones that have been inactive for a long time and unverified, have really low right-party contact rates. So we do a very detailed look at a portfolio of phone numbers. And this is a collapse of the green, yellow, orange, and reds. And looking at the metrics that we all know are the critical metrics, which is right-party contact rates and dollar collected per dial. And I'll walk through this because I think it's very illustrative of the type of efficiencies that can be gained in this particular application. So I'm going to start with the column that says worst, which is red. And if we work across that column, you'll see this is where 44% of the phones in this portfolio we got categorized as worst, which is they're reassigned or inactive. The RPC rate in yellow in this category is 0.4%. That's compared to the average RPC of 2.3%. It took 250 dials per right party contact, and the dollars collected per dial was $2 per dial. If you look at the best category in green, it's 20% of the portfolio, 7.5% RPC rate, and it's $38.46 collected per dial. So if you're manually dialing everything and you have limited operational capacity, there's no reason to dial, or there may be, but certainly you want to prioritize your queue and start with the best phones and work your way down. Between the best, better, and bad phones within this portfolio, 92% of the revenue was captured, with 55% of the operational capacity or focus on the phone numbers. So you could arguably remove the worst 44% and lose very little revenue. And that's where we've seen that for companies that have chosen to move all of their dials to a manual environment, there needs to be a way to prioritize how the dials are done or to really focus on more accurate data. And we've seen this pretty consistently across many companies that we're working with. There is the opportunity to say, if you get consent along the way and you can maintain verification, that those in the best category could actually move to an auto dial environment with little risk. And in a first-party world, certainly verified phone numbers where you have consent can be auto dialed with minimal risk. And this is where we've seen that accurate data that's current and updated can add a lot of value in the operational strain that's placed with complying with Tcpa risk. And it's a lot to digest, so we're happy to walk through this in other environments. But in summary, so we can get to a couple questions, authoritative, accurate, daily data, of course, is important. Verifying ownership and reassignments and phone type is important. And we found the activity insights that we can glean from all the work that we do have been equally important along with ownership for an operational efficiency perspective. Because part of the challenge of Tcpa risk is not just identifying ownership and reassignments, it's dealing with the operational impact of managing towards Tcpa. And we've found that activity data is, has been a fundamental and critical component. And then it's prioritizing the best phone numbers and cutting the bad phone numbers. So those are some, a real-life application of the data and how some companies are deploying it and the impact that they're seeing. And that wraps us up today. So thank you all for listening. I hope it was an hour well spent. We covered a lot of ground. We're happy to take a few questions at the time that we have, and certainly meet or talk with anybody outside of the webinar.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mitch. And definitely information-packed 55 minutes so far. I've got my eye on the clock here. So we've got about 5 minutes for questions. So let me just jump right in and ask a few. And I do see a lot of questions in the queue. So thank you all for putting those in. And like I said, if we don't get to them, which we won't get to all of them, there's no way, but we will follow up. So the first question here for the panelists, Mitch and Becky: how can companies protect themselves and verify that the number still belongs to the consumer who provided consent?
I think there's two parts. I think that's a legal question and a data question, Becky. I mean, from a data perspective, we have a verification service that does that. The challenge is there's no silver bullet, right? There's no solution that is 100%. We would never claim that ours is either. So certainly we have about as good as coverage as I think that's available out there. But how you protect yourself, is not a question that I feel comfortable answering that one. I don't know if, Becky, you have thoughts from a legal perspective.
Sure. Well, I think that even the FCC acknowledges in the order that there's no silver bullet. They list a number of best practices that could be used, and that, over time would allow you to find out about reassigned numbers. And so, for example, it is like having an interactive voice ability to confirm whether you've got the correct person when you call, and or using the kind of database service that Neustar offers, and that there are other offerings like that. But there is a list of them. There is, in light of the no silver bullet answer, which the FCC acknowledged, they did provide this one free call exemption, or exception. But as Mitch said, it's very hard to turn that into a meaningful exception unless you're calling a number for the first time, essentially.
Great, wonderful. Thank you both. And let's see, next question here. What database services does Neustar provide that can help determine whether a number has been reassigned as referenced in the FCC order?
I think we just covered that one. So we really have one database, and it fuels everything that we have. So it's the same solutions we pretty much use for, lots of different applications, both in the telco world and in the non-telco world.
Okay, sounds good. Let me ask you another question while we've got some time here. What happens if the telco carrier decide to offer subscriptions that do not charge per minute, just the cost of the phone, in a service plan that's not tied to minutes? Okay, let me see here.
Okay, no, I understand.
You got it? Okay, I was going to read you. Okay.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. In 1991, Congress was concerned about cost shifting, but the FCC, the regulation applies to any auto dial call to a wireless number, or any text to a wireless number. Then there are other questions about, like, for example, maybe VoIP services, where the question of whether there's a per call charge may be relevant. But wireless calls and texts, the fact that there is no per minute charge, for example, is not relevant. So TCPA still covers it.
Gotcha. Thank you. All right. Once again, thanks to the audience for so many great questions. Next one here. Does the new ruling apply to automated calls for balance reminders for first-party collections? We are a hospital that makes automated calls for past due balance. No PHI is released, just a recorded message giving options to pay online. Does this apply?
So for the extent that your call is not a telemarketing call, which a balance reminder or a collections call of some sort would be, you do not need advance prior written express consent, although you do need prior express consent, which generally, if the person provides you the number, you can use that. But all of the rules about what is auto-dialed, an auto-dialer, what do who is the called party, the one free call for reassigned numbers, all of those apply to both the marketing and the collections or informational context. So the only thing that's different is you need not have the advance prior written consent in a non-marketing situation.
Great, thanks. Thank you, Becky. And we are right at the top of the hour, but so many great questions. I just want to slip one more question in here if everyone will stay with me. It seems the origin of TCPA focused on curbing unwanted marketing calls. How did this morph into to include debt collection calls?
Well, the three areas that Congress and the FCC cited are unwanted telemarketing calls, invasion of privacy from the auto dialers and not random and sequentially dialed numbers, and the blocking large blocks of numbers with auto dialers from a public safety standpoint. But the regs have always covered both telemarketing and informational or non-telemarketing calls. It's only in the 2013 order that the FCC actually began distinguishing between marketing and non-marketing calls.
Got it. Thank you so much. And that does bring us just a couple minutes past the top of the hour. With that, we try to bring these things as close to on schedule as possible, respecting everyone's time. Let me first of all thank Mitch and Becky for being here today. It's been a great information-packed hour, lots of engagement with the audience here, lots of questions. It's always a great sign. I want to thank the audience for being here. Of course, you make it worthwhile. We would definitely not want to do it without you, so thanks for being here. Everyone that's with us today, we will be sending you an email probably within the next 24 to 48 hours. You'll get a link to the presentation you've seen here today and also recording to our discussion as well, so please keep an eye out for that and review at your leisure in the future. We encourage you to do that. And with that, I will wrap things up. Wish everyone a wonderful rest of the day, and I hope you'll join us again here very soon. Thanks so much.